whole bunch of stuff on around Tickle. And maybe there are some scripts, you do a little bit of scripting, but the scripts are small. Most of the interesting stuff is all these Tickle extensions that people have built in the application, the main application. And that the application would be large compared to the size of the Tickle interpreter. So you think of Tickle is small compared to the application, and scripts are small compared to all of this. And that was not what happened. Well, I mean, there was some of this, of course, but what happened is that these shells, Tickle SH and Wish, arose, which were basically just a wrapper around either Tickle or Tickle plus TK. And I think the only addition is a command line reader to read commands from a script file or from standard in. Now, I don't remember how this came about. I don't think I came up with this idea. I don't think I was the first person to do it. I don't know if anybody remembers. Did Tickle X? Anybody remember? Perhaps Tickle X built a shell around.
Yeah, that's why it was called TCL. When you built it, the shell was just TCL, not Tickle SH.
Certainly, by the time you distributed EK at Summer Unix 1991, Wish was in it.
Wish was there.
Wish was there.
Although I recall a little after that you being astonished that I was doing interesting things without ever having to find a new Tickle command in Z.
Yeah, so the interesting consequence was that there was enough stuff just between Tickle and TK to provide the functions people needed to build full applications. And then the second, even bigger surprise was the amount of scripts that people built. It's kind of falling off the edge of the screen here, so it's hard to see. But I think it was maybe the second Tickle conference. Was the second one the first one that was here in New Orleans?
Yeah, but the first was where we presented the paper with your jaw against your chest.
Berkeley.
The first one was at Berkeley. So if you mentioned it there, it didn't really sink in, but when it came to the second one, and Gerald mentioned that there was 500,000 lines of Tickle code controlling some multi-billion-dollar platform off in the Gulf of Mexico someplace. I had this, it was this combination of surprise, confusion, and a fair amount of nausea. That made no sense to me at all. I couldn't imagine, how could you possibly build, this is a language that's designed for typing one-line scripts, not for 500,000 line scripts. It was just a total shock to me. It actually took me a long time to get used to it, that it could even make sense, because the Tickle was not designed as a language for building big programs, and lacked things like object-oriented programming, stuff like that, I'll talk about in a minute. That was a real surprise to me. I eventually got comfortable with it, but that was not how I designed Tickle. And so when I talk about some of the retrospective stuff, you can argue, was Tickle, given this is the way it was going to end up with these long scripts, was Tickle really the best language to do that, or would we have been better off with some other language? That was a huge surprise to me. Okay, so I thought what I do now is do a little bit of a retrospective, talk briefly about what I think really worked well, slap ourselves in the back too much, and then talk more about, if I was doing it again today, what are things I would do differently, or at least think about doing differently? Don't know if I would end up actually, in the end, doing them differently. But first, what worked well? There's a fairly long list, but to me, the top 3 things are, Tickle really did work out as an embeddable scripting language. It's, I don't know if anybody has used Lua, but to me there's nothing else that's ever, either before or after, that's worked as well for embeddable scripting as Tickle. Maybe, I've heard Lua is a new embeddable scripting language that's getting a lot of attention, so maybe that's working out well, but at least before that I think there was nothing else that could do that. Then the second thing is that TK made it really, really easy to create GUIs. Now, of course, having motif as competition helps a lot. But I think it's arguable that TK has been the easiest way of any system around to create GUIs, and furthermore to create fairly powerful GUIs. Nobody else has had things like the text and canvas widgets we managed to have, and the reason those were so powerful is because there was a runtime language available. Even after you create the widgets, there's this language around at runtime that you can use to modify the widgets and change them dynamically, and do really interesting things. And then the third thing, which came late, Tickle and TK were there from relatively early on, but the third thing was cross-platform support that we added in when I went to Sun Microsystems that allowed you to build interfaces that would run on many different platforms. So those are the top 3 for me. Is there Would anybody argue that something else is as important as those three with tickle and TK?
How extensible it is. Yeah. How easy it is to extend it as opposed to embed it.
Extend, I see. I sort of lumped that together in here. But
I'd also say expressiveness, so it's possible to do useful things in that much code, and therefore it's a lot easier to explain them.
Interesting. The conciseness improves explainability. Yeah.
It's kind of got the Lisp nature in that you can design your own embedded languages within it without having all of Lisp's peculiarities. You don't have-
It's Tickle and Lisp are in a sense both what I think of as von Neumann languages. In the sense of, if you think about the hallmark of a von Neumann machine, is that code and data are stored in the same memory. And the meaning of something is decided by the instruction that references that memory location rather than by some intrinsic property of the memory location. Most programming languages change that. They have defined intrinsic properties of every storage location. It has particular behaviors assigned to it, whereas both Tickle and Lisp, I think you can store things and use them in many different ways.
I think the simplicity and regularity of the syntax.
Simplicity and regularity of the syntax?
The fact that proc is a command, just like any other command.
And why is that a good thing?
You can have, it's very easy to make code that makes code.
This is essentially repeating what everybody else said, but putting all of the precedents and operators into one command like expression was brilliant because it kept it out of the rest of the language.
I think it's really facile with text, and one of my things yesterday is that almost all applications do way more manipulating of strings, even scientific applications and control systems and things like that, manipulate text primarily, and so that it's easy to do powerful things with text is really important.
I think that's a hallmark of scripting languages in general, this notion that you're doing a lot of text manipulation, and Tickle and other languages like Perl and Python also tend to make it relatively easy to manipulate strings.
On the theme of what worked well, I think one of the things in the history that's very remarkable is the transition you made from Tickle 7 to Tickle 8, getting the speed into the language with the Tickle OBJ and all of the associated things without losing the everything is a string definition of how the language functions.
Although we did lose some of the simplicity. Now there's the number of methods that are there for manipulating these arguments of various types. That kind of blew up when we added the Tickle OBJ stuff. But of course there was still, you could still use the old style interface if you wanted, but then you wouldn't get the speed advantage. Okay, so those are some of the things that worked out well. I thought I'd pick a few things that I might do differently if I was starting again. So the first one is, this to me is a no-brainer. Tickle should have. Somebody should take a photograph here. We're standing by this.
I'm just glad he's not here.
Yes, Michael, you were right. So you should have just had it from the beginning. And ironically, there's nothing about OO that really conflicts with Tickle. Really, the syntax, honestly, it's possible to do object-oriented systems that fit just fine. It would be natural mesh with the Tickle syntax. So, why didn't this happen? Mostly my fault. I was too stubborn and too slow to really learn the benefits of OO stuff. I don't think I actually finally totally got it until I've been programming in C++ for a couple of years as part of Electric Cloud, maybe 10 years ago. Then finally, it's funny, I've said this before, but at the same time I was arguing against OO and Tickle, I was saying this, that if you don't have something, it's really easy to convince yourself that you didn't need it. And then once you get it, you realize how foolish you were. So anyhow, sorry, Michael, you were right. Michael argued, of course, passionately for many, many years. Yeah.
The bizarre thing is that TK is object-oriented.
That is the funny thing, that in fact the interface to TK is very close. Yeah, very close. It's very, very close to an object-oriented syntax. Yeah. So, although I might still argue a little bit with Michael about what the right syntax is for this. I think, so Tickle is great, and it's been very, very popular, but the syntax is more a C++ syntax that isn't quite as natural a fit for the Tickle language. as, I forget which other ones, I think O-Tickle was the first one that had a more natural fit, and I've seen O-Tickle more on the TCT news group lately, although I can't remember the details of either of those syntaxes. But there are other syntaxes, I think, that are really nice fit with Tickle. They're probably more like the TK widget syntax, for example. So it's a shame, and part of the problem was by the time I started to realize this was probably the right thing to do, we were already at the point where there were several competing OO syntaxes out there, and then it was really hard to pick a winner among all of those. And so that was just another excuse to delay the decision, which then just sort of made things worse. So this one, there's just no question in my mind. I think let's do it again. Just get it in there from the beginning and be done with it.
Having said that, now that it's in there, the beauty is you're not forced to use it, unlike other languages where you can't start out with a small script and grow it because you have to get all that OO plumbing in place first.
Yeah, I would guess you could do it in a way that you wouldn't have to use it anymore. That it'll be there if you want, but that not everything would absolutely have to be an object.
And that's the way it is with Tickle OO. And
anybody going to disagree with me on this one?
I'm just glad he's not here.
Well, he would disagree about that, but Inker's not right.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's something reasonable people can argue about. I think we can agree on the basic idea that it should have been there from the beginning. Something should have been there from the start. And the second thing I would do differently, I would do some things differently, and I'd think about other things, is how to harness the community better. And I don't feel like we ever did a very good job of this. The first thing is that it's been too hard for people to contribute their own extensions to Tickle. And I'm not sure why I didn't immediately jump to the idea that if the language is going to be extensible and you want to encourage people to build extensions, there should be some really easy way for people to exchange extensions among each other. So we really should have had a web-based repository of Tickle extensions from the beginning, something like CPAN for Perl, or there's equivalent things for Ruby gems that are out there, where anybody can post extensions, people can rate each other's extensions and comment on them, and there's version management stuff to keep track of how they relate to the Tickle versions. And then Tickle should have built-in support for just automatically downloading and incorporating extensions. It should be really, really trivial to name and grab any extension that's in the repository. It's just very sad that we never built this. So as a result, I think some of the other systems ended up getting way more public extensions than Tickle did, because it was really easy for people to build them and share them. And the reason people like to do this, of course, is then they become a little bit famous themselves. You have something that other people are using. And that was easy to do with Perl, but not as easy to do with Tickle.
Were you hiding behind the curtain last night in the bath in the suite, since that was half of the bath?
It wasn't there, so I totally missed it. So that's the first half of harnessing the community as a repository. And the second half, so this one is harder and still sort of goes against, in some ways, the way I like to work as a computer scientist. But I think we should have made it easier for more people to contribute to the core as well as contributing extensions. And this is a tough trade-off. And I think you see this in other open source packages where there's a spectrum you can choose with an open source package. At one end, you can be very, very controlling and restrictive about what goes into the public releases of the core stuff. And certainly in the early days of Tickle, we were as far at that extreme as you could possibly do. Until I went to Sun, every line of code in the core came off my fingertips. There was no such thing as a contribution. You could send me code, and then, which, for example, Carl and Mark did, and I would take bits and pieces of it and rewrite them and put them in the core. But nothing sort of written by somebody else went directly into the core. So there's some reasons for this, besides just megalomania. But one is I think it's much easier to maintain a consistent architecture in the system if you have a small number of people or just one person doing it. Because if you have a zillion people doing it, they won't all understand the grand scheme of the architecture, or they won't. It'll just sort of gradually start slipping as different people interpret things in different ways. I think you could potentially avoid bugs this way because, again, if you let a lot of people contribute, they won't understand all the implications of the things they're doing, and so you get more bugs. But the result is you have much slower progress and many fewer features. So that's one extreme, the control extreme. Then the other extreme is to maximize progress. We just want as much stuff as possible. And so you just open the gates wide. In the extreme, you let essentially anybody contribute anything to the core. You have essentially no controls over anything. And the good news about this is that the feature set is going to grow like crazy that way. And many of the open source packages with the richest feature sets they tend to have relatively loose controls. But the downside is that the structure is going to end up being chaotic. Again, there won't be much architectural uniformity. The code will be all different kinds of qualities. There will be zillions of bugs, but there's actually a flip side there. There'll be more bugs, but they'll also get fixed faster because there's more people out there to contribute fixes to them. So I'm not sure which approach actually results in the least buggy software. The maximal progress one will have probably more bugs, but they'll be short-lived, whereas the more controlled approach will have fewer bugs, but they're likely to live longer. So in the early days of Tickle, we were very much on this extreme, gradually opened it up, but I don't think we ever really got very far down in this direction. And I suspect that was probably bad for Tickle. But part of it is I'm just a cleanliness, craftsmanship, clean architecture nut. To me, it's just the idea that Tickle wasn't going to be beautiful inside was almost unbearable to me. And so I probably kept too much control over it. So if I were doing it again, I would try very, very hard to force myself down in this direction. Whether I'd actually be able to do that or not, I don't know. But I'm convinced I was too much of a control freak, especially in the early days of Tickle. And by the way, one of the goals of establishing the Tickle core team was to try and loosen the controls and get more people involved and hopefully make it easier for stuff to get into the Tickle core. I'm not sure whether that has actually happened or not. In fact, it's possible things even got worse and that rather than having one person have to approve things, many people have to approve now. You have to get a bunch of people together in order to make decisions. So that leads me to my next poll, which is how would you characterize the ability of people to participate in, think of it as the core of Tickle and TK today. From one extreme, the controls are so loose that the system is becoming a wreck. To the other extreme, the controls are so tight that we're not making anywhere near enough progress. Or if we think it's roughly the right balance, that would be the middle one. So let's start with the controls too loose, system becoming a mess. How many people think we're at that point right now? What about controls not quite tight enough? Well, it's getting a little loose, but it's not a disaster yet. 0. I'm not surprised, at least, by the way. What about we're about right? Things are where they should be. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Controls a bit too tight. 15. 6. And controls are way too tight. We're not making enough progress. Only 2. Okay.
I think there is a second dimension to that. As we tend to keep whatever we get forever, backwards compatibility, it's much more important to have tight control because you never can, or it's hard to correct a mistake. So if backwards compatibility wasn't that important, it would be easier to loosen the controls.
That's an interesting thought that you need the controls in order to maintain compatibility. When you start off, I thought you were going to say something different. I thought what you're going to say is we've got all this old stuff we've got to maintain, and so we need more and more people contributing because there's more and more battles to fight. I see your point as well.
John, I think in the early days, Hindsight, because you look at it now, but I think it was a correct decision in the early days for you to maintain tight control. It allowed the language and all to mature to a point where it was stable, and there was enough of the stability, enough of the base structure that now people can add on and still keep it clean.
I see. So control a lot in the beginning and then gradually ease up on the reins. Once there's enough of the structure is well enough established that no one can come in and screw it up, it's too hard to mess it up. The other thing is in the early days the structure may be changing as well, so then if you want to change it in a rational way, you probably need fairly tight controls to keep it from just becoming total chaos.
I think there's another dimension as well, which is not whether the controls are too light or too loose, but it's a question of distributing the controls.
What do you mean by distributing the controls?
So if when a system is modular, it's possible to delegate control of the various modules. If there's a hierarchy, it can be delegated down.
So you made me think of the Linux model. I was wondering about that also. So with the TCT, we have one committee responsible for everything. Everybody sort of has say in everything, whereas the Linux model is that Linus Torvalds approves everything, but he delegates responsibility to various subsystems to other people who are dictators in their own domains. So there's many people, but within each domain there's a dictator. So maybe that would have been a better approach. Is that what you're advocating?
One of the aspects of this is, though, that controls being too tight or too loose, because of Tickle's extensible nature, I don't think that's as critical a thing as it would be in some other projects. People feel stymied, they can't get their code in the core. The extension interfaces are so good, they can do just about everything in an extension, where they're free to do what they want.
I see. Although that can lead to some chaos. So the object-oriented stuff is an example of that. People could build their own systems outside the core, but then you end up with several different competing schemes.
Essentially, chaos is built into your original design language, where every command puts its own meaning on whatever it wants.
Some chaos is good.
Yeah, I'll echo Don's comment, because I think one of the strong suits for Tickle, especially in the early years, was that your code was very clean. I could read it like a novel. The first thing I did when I picked up Tickle was I added some perfect hatching to take out the string comparison, because I wanted to speed things up. It didn't. But I put it in there. It was easy. And I could not put it into the core, because it didn't belong there. That was a good thing. Carl could build his extensions. He could build whichever he wanted, and then he could pick up the ones that were good. For the OO stuff, we had a whole bunch of competing extensions. I like what we got a lot. I didn't like any of the others that much. But taking the best of all of the extensions, it gave us the field of many flowers and could pick the blooms we liked.
It was painful, but I think in the end we got a much better OO system that really fits Tickle.
Yes.
So is it OO Tickle? That's
Tickle OO.
Tickle OO. Sorry. Shows you how out of touch I am. Actually, I should look at the syntax. I'm curious to see which syntax we ended up with.
None of the above.
Yes.
So the next area I would consider, and I'm not sure of the right answer here, but I would consider, should Tickle have done less than it did? And I suspect that may be a hard sell in this audience, but let me try the argument on you. Over the years, Tickle ended up solving a huge number of problems. The problem of embedded scripting, GUI interface development, cross-platform development, to some degree the web. It has multi-threading, and it also has an event loop. And the list just goes on and on and on, internationalization, and on and on and on. And the result of this is that we ended up with a very large code base and fighting many wars on many different fronts and trying to fight them all at the same time. And it's not clear to me we've ever had the resources to really fight all of those wars effectively. So for example, one of the toughest ones has been on the TK side, I think, keeping the widget library updated to reflect the latest look and feel on the various platforms. Because we have 3 different platforms and they're all moving in different directions, and it's just a huge amount of work to try and fight all those battles. And furthermore, we ended up with different constituencies in the community that had pretty different needs and desires. Like people just using Tickle embedded might not have cared much about, say, a compiler. They wanted the system to be really, really lightweight and really simple, not a lot of extra junk in the core. But for standalone scripting, you want everything into this kitchen sink, everything you can possibly imagine all in this one application. Tickle should be super rich and powerful, and it has to have a compiler to make it really fast to run Gerald's 500,000 line scripts and stuff like that. And in comparison, if you look at some of the things we competed with, and we competed with many different things in different ways, Python, just a script, didn't have to worry about any of the GUI stuff, for example. Some of the other toolkits like Qt and GTK and whatever they're using on Linux nowadays, they could just do Linux. They didn't have to worry about also supporting Windows and Macintosh. And so I think as a result, it's been really hard to keep up with all these different things happening on all these fronts with all these other competitors.
I don't think you can have it both ways.
Can't have it both ways.
I don't think you can create a language that is as extensible as TCL and not have that happen. Otherwise, it would have been Python. It would have been something else. These other languages have restrictions in the way they work that prevent us from doing certain things.
Maybe that's, you're saying that's just part of the nature of Tickle. It had to be that way.
If you had made it less extensible so you could control that, it wouldn't be able to do all the things that it can do now.
I don't think of a Swiss Army knife. It's not a very good knife, and it's not a very good corkscrew, and it's not a very good screwdriver. But having all of them in your pocket, and it does each of those jobs adequately, is why everybody has one.
Is it a Swiss Army knife, or there's this tool, I'm trying to think of the...
Multi-tool.
No, there's this wrench tool with a little screw handle thing. And one of my colleagues characterized that as the wrong tool for every job. ViceScript, that's what it's called.
You've created a language here that is a DSL based, domain-specific languages. So everything someone does in a certain domain is going to look different. It's going to have a same syntax, but it's going to be different.
So the risk is you end up being jack of all trades but master of none. The Swiss Army knife something is pretty good at lots of things, but it isn't fantastic at anything because there's too much stuff there.
The GTK and Qt example, yes, they started out as just Linux, but they've tried to broaden themselves to all the other two platforms, which is debatable success.
Just from the perspective of an insider, I think there's been, over the years, considerable regret in the core team that certain things were adopted as language components and that we didn't go earlier to some scheme of bundled extensions, where less extensions being approved by the core team as the distributors make them universally available, but don't adopt them for maintenance.
I see. That way you can eventually kill them off.
Or also adopt their competitors.
And they can easily evolve an independent calendar.
So, for example,
you don't have
SQLite's distributed with the core, well, mostly. We don't maintain it.
You don't have to synchronize releases and things like that. So the next poll.
I will say, of your list of problems you tried to solve, except for the web, for my application, we've got a very large application. There's only 2 of us developers working on it, and we need all those things. If it didn't support all of those things, and I think it's better than a Swiss Army knife that does a half-assed job. I think it does a pretty good job at most of them. It wouldn't be useful to us if it didn't do all those.
It does at least a 90% job.
Well, because of its generalism, what it is fantastic at is prototype.
Then the prototype becomes the production code.
Well, the prototype works so well, we never actually make production.
That's agile.
Well, as I recall, that was one of the ways Tickle and TK spread in the early days, is people convinced their bosses to come and try a quick prototype in it, and then it ended up working so well that they decided they didn't need to build the real thing.
Yes.
We use it to prototype. I don't think we're giving out secrets here. We've just about to release another iOS app, October 15th. But the prototype was written in TCL/TK, and that was shipped off to some outsourcers who built it for iOS, based on the working TCL/TK application as the prototype.
And the prototype was fully functional.
It's just that we couldn't put it on iOS.
That's a very nice requirement spec right there.
Yeah.
So this may not be the right audience to try this poll, but let me try this one anyhow. The idea of this one is to try and get a sense for the degree to which there are different constituencies with competing needs. So this poll is you're voting against things. That is, which of these things actually are not important to you in your usage of Tickle and or TK? And maybe in this audience we're going to find everybody uses everything, but let's try this. So how many people here, embedded scripting isn't that important? You tend to do everything with Tickle SH or Wish? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What about standalone scripting is not really important to you? Mostly the way you use Tickle is embedded in an application. You don't write that many scripts. Why not? GUI support, not important to you. Don't use TK, you really just use Tickle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Around the end of the .com era, when we were sort of closing out scripting, several people came to me and said, you know, you should just give up on TK. The web is being used for all the user interface stuff now. You should just focus on Tickle as embeddable scripting aspects. Couldn't quite bring myself to do that. What about cross-platform? How many people don't really care about cross-platform stuff? Well, that's interesting. Which platform are you, by the way?
We work for an OS now.
What about thread support? People don't really need thread support. 15. As I recall, that was a fairly major source of complexity when we eventually implemented that. And what about web? How many people don't really use Tickle in conjunction with the web at all? 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm guessing this is an audience, again, of more people that tend to do everything, and so there's probably less of a division here than there is in the world at large. But even so, you can see there's fairly major categories of stuff here in Tickle that not everybody uses.
So much.
Right?
It's because there's so much.
The next area which I would reconsider, not sure whether it's in a different place or not, but is Tickle the right language syntax, knowing the way it's actually used as opposed to the way I thought it would be used when I started the project. So the problems with the current syntax are, first, that I think some people have trouble understanding because it's just not the way most programming languages work. Interesting that you say that this tends to affect the experts more than the novices. And then the other thing is that it's pretty hard to make Tickle efficient because things are so dynamic. Even with the bytecodes and Tickle OBJs, Tickle's still relatively slow on the scale of all languages. In fact, I don't know how many languages there are that are slower than Tickle. I think Ruby may actually be slower than Tickle, but that would probably be a close battle there. And most scripting languages can compile more efficiently than Tickle. So the question is there a different syntax that would work better? We could certainly fix these problems, but then if we did that, would it be easy to embed it? Would it be easy to extend it, or would the extension interface become really complicated and much more restrictive than we have right now? So I don't really know the answer to this question, but there's certainly been enough issues with the problems. If I were starting again, I would at least think about that and see if there's some other syntax that works better. Kevin?
Yeah, I'd argue that we're down a road where it isn't either or. That we have